Going back 2 years, when I first emailed Sean about doing some artwork for the channel, at the time I probably had about 14 ideas sat ready to script, mapped out in front of me. I'd say that since then, the bulk of the stories that have actually made it onto the channel are not part of those 14 original scripts, most of which are still sat in the corner of my room gathering dust. Because I suffer from a mild form of distraction, which basically means that whenever a new idea pops into my head, I can't help but start working on it, which means that the older stuff just keeps getting pushed further and further back, which is frustrating. Most of these newer ideas are generated by books that I stumble across in secondhand shops or quite random recommendations that come to me on Amazon. You've probably seen me tease a couple of these books in the channel's community section, and they're nothing if not niche. It's probably why they end up dumped by people in secondhand bookshops, but their loss, my gain. Inside pretty much each of the ones that I read, there's usually one paragraph or one sentence with something utterly random and sometimes banal, and it will get into my head, it will percolate inside my warped old brain, and an hour or so later I will be walking around the house trying to do something like take the recycling out or tidy up after the kids, and I will suddenly go, no, I've got to get my phone out now and I've got to spend 5 minutes coming up with that idea. And it does my wife's head in. I mean, filling the house with secondhand books also does her head in as well. It's hard to figure out which is worse. The reason I mention this is that Tag, the short story we've just done, is a perfect example of this. The book in question on that occasion was by the historian Charles Whiting, and it detailed the history of American forces trying to penetrate the siege-freed line after Normandy. It's not a nice read. About 4 chapters in, there's a section that is dealing with the fact that the Americans went from taking very few casualties to taking a lot of casualties, and suddenly had to figure out how to deal with the large number of dead bodies that were coming back from the front line. And to do that, they constructed 2 new military cemeteries, one in France, one in Belgium. And the soldiers who were working there, dealing with the bodies coming back from the front line, began to experience a slightly odd phenomenon. And that was that in some of the bags they opened, they found that the GIs who were lying there had their dog tags wedged between their teeth. So they made a few inquiries back on the front line, and basically what was going on was an urban legend of the time. And that was that if you looked at a World War II American dog tag, there is an indentation in it. And what these GIs had convinced themselves, or probably one of them had and told everyone else, was that the reason that indentation was there is that you could stick it in between the teeth, stick it inside somebody's mouth. And that was the purpose of it, that bodies were supposed to go back from the front line with the dog tag sticking out the mouth, because it was the easiest way of keeping it safe and the easiest form of access. Needless to say, that's not why it was there. And it happened that just the machine they used to press out the dog tags left this mark in it, this indentation. That was just the technology of it. And I just, within about an hour of reading that, I forget what I was doing, probably washing up, I do a lot of that. This idea just popped into my head, and it was an idea of some scumbag thief at this military cemetery stealing the possessions of the dead, and a bunch of shambling zombie American corpses, all of which have got dog tags wedged in their mouth, basically slashing or eating this guy to death. That's just, how my warped brain works. And the more I started to get into researching vengeful spirits, which isn't technical, I just tend to say, what vengeful spirits does each society and background have, the more I got pulled back to Native American lore. I'd gone down that tunnel for the Wendigo, I'd gone down that tunnel for the Bok, and quite quickly I stumbled across the Apache spirit of vengeance, the Chindi, which is a good one because it's relatively indescribable, so you don't have to worry about what it looks like. And the only common feature in all the stories is you do not want to get on the wrong side of it. So after that, all I needed really to fill in the story was an infantry unit who fought in the Ardennes, who were largely from the Midwest. And that's essentially how the Timberwolves came into it. They had a lot of people from those states. There was a good chance that they'd have Native Americans fighting there, and that's how they made it into the bill. If you think there's anything more technical to how I work, sorry to disappoint you. But I'm sitting here now doing this production video, the main part of which isn't tag, it's chattel. And it strikes me that I've somehow inadvertently managed to do two stories back to back where the bad guys are vengeful spirits. Which really annoys me because I try really hard to try and break things up. But hopefully there's enough differences in the two stories that it doesn't annoy you guys. I mean, you might just not get annoyed as easy as I do. The book that Chattel came out of, because again it was completely unplanned, was a book called Fugitives, which is by an author called Danny Orbach, and I will put the link in the description below. It is a great read. Sometimes it's a tough read, and it chronicles how a dwindling bunch of Hitler's followers managed to escape Germany in the dying days of the war and found varying degrees of safety in the Middle East. In the years that passed, the British and the Americans, and to a less degree the Russians, became more interested in capturing Nazis rather than killing them. The French and the Israelis took a very different point of view in that we just want payback, and that's as simple as it is. But that wasn't easy, because you had countries like Egypt and Syria that were very keen to welcome veterans from World War II, from whatever nation, into their countries, because their skills and expertise could help train their new armies. To an extent that in places such as Egypt, the government offered German veterans very high wages, secure houses, and whole new identities, which made the work of your average jobbing French assassin quite hard. The good news was that for every technically qualified and drilled German refugee soldier, there were about 10 lazy Nazi sympathising bullies with a drink problem. So the Egyptians would give these people contracts for 2-3 years to train their army and realised quite quickly that these men that sold themselves as high up German technical specialists were just drunk SS bullies who had managed to get lucky. They'd get found out in that country, they'd be kicked out, and then they'd rock up in the next border along, volunteer their services, and the cycle would begin anew. But while they were doing that, they suddenly found themselves subject to a campaign of attrition from the French Secret Service, who were very unhappy that they were funneling loads of World War II German weaponry into countries that were now sparking up into colonial revolution. So these transitory Germans suddenly found that people were driving past and trying to shoot them, and their cars were suddenly exploding when they got in them, and their secretaries were opening letters that demolished their office to kill the secretary. And it became quite hard. I mean, there were a lot of innocent people killed by the French while they were doing it. So in essence, as the years passed on after 1945, life became so uncomfortable and difficult for these nomadic Nazis that were moving all around the Middle East that in the end, a lot found surrendering to authorities and going to prison far safer than working in the arms industry. Somebody also pointed out to me that apparently this has the position of being the channel's first post-war vid. That's great. Absolutely not intentional, I promise you. I should have probably done one by now already. I've just been distracted by buying loads of books and reading other stories. But it was whilst I was reading Orbach's book that old Horst Stark suddenly popped back into my head. Our fugitive SS man who likes to dabble in the supernatural to make weapons. When I came up with him, he was never going to be a recurring character. He was just going to be a foil by which his boss, Graf von Stahlheim, got turned into a recurring villain moving forward. However, having survived the supernatural suicide bomber antics in Anatema, I decided to help him escape using a piece of kit he'd stolen from his boss. And he fitted perfectly into this transitory post-war landscape that I just read about. I don't think now, for a second, it's the last we've heard of him. As soon as I uploaded Chattel last week, I got a ton of messages from people saying, well, when's he going to get killed then? When's his past going to catch up with him? Will it? I don't know. We'll see. I think we're going to have to go back to him further down the line somewhere. I just need to figure out when's going to work and how will be the best way to bump him off. If I do bump him off, I mean, he might have a nice life. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in relation to this episode, though, just in terms of not who you were rooting for, but I suppose who you were less willing to see die. I deliberately wrote Sasha Gio as a nasty piece of work, and I deliberately wrote Stark as a bit regretful and more human than he had been. So if at any point you find yourself thinking, oh, I want Gio dead, oh, actually, Stark's a bad guy as well, maybe they could both die, then I feel like I've done my job there, because I'm not a writer. I haven't got any qualifications. I haven't got any training. I'm just a Burke that puts stories out on the internet. But if for a second I made you feel conflicted about who you were cheering for, then that means that I can actually do some basic character development. And that's what I want. I want to be able to create a character that is as divisive and provokes the audience response that Lucius does, who again was a complete fluke. I don't really know how I managed to stumble across him, to be honest. Is there any decency left in Horst Stark? Can he be saved? It's up to you. You be the judge. Finally, going full circle, and as a complete tease, here is the latest book that I have been reading. Did I get a story out of it? Yes, I did. Am I going to tell you what that story is? No. No, I'm not. Anyway, thank you as always. Much love to you all. See you next time.